There are betrayals that happen quietly, behind closed doors, whispered about only in hushed tones among those who think they know the truth. And then there are betrayals staged under the brightest lights, in rooms so crowded with power and wealth that every insult becomes a public spectacle. Eleanor Whitmore's betrayal was of the latter kind. The kind you can't ignore. The kind that forces you to either bow your head and retreat or sharpen your resolve until it can cut through steel. Eleanor had spent 18 years as the picture of loyalty. She had stood beside her husband, Gregory Whitmore, through economic downturns, through vicious property disputes, through the exhausting climb from one underfunded real estate project to a glittering empire of skyscrapers. They were a fixture in New York's upper-crust circles, not the loudest or flashiest couple, but one whose presence carried the kind of weight that came from enduring relevance. By the winter of that year, cracks in their marriage were obvious to anyone willing to look closely. Gregory was restless, increasingly enamored with attention that came from outside his marriage. Eleanor had chosen to ignore whispers, perhaps out of hope that he would eventually grow tired of his distractions and return to the partnership they had once shared. What she didn't anticipate was that the humiliation would one day be handed to her not in private, but in full view of the city's most influential people. The heart of the Metropolis Gala was an annual display of affluence and philanthropy, a night when Manhattan's elite gathered under the pretense of raising money for children's hospitals but, in reality, used the event as a stage to reinforce their social dominance. The venue glittered massive crystal chandeliers poured light onto tables crowded with white orchids and silver-rimmed champagne flutes. In every corner, voices traded news of deals, political shifts, and upcoming social events. For years, Eleanor had moved through these galas like a seasoned diplomat, aware of every nuance, every subtle exchange that defined status. On that particular night, she entered in a navy silk gown Carolina Herrera, understated but cut to flatter her figure. It was a dress she had worn before, one she felt comfortable in. She preferred timeless over trendy. But the choice, whether she realized it or not, marked her as out of step with the mood of the room. Around her, younger socialites shimmered in sequins, daring necklines, and brand new couture straight from Paris. She was a study in quiet dignity, which should have been a strength. Unfortunately, Gregory's companion for the evening made sure it wasn't seen that way. April Monroe was 27, a reality television personality whose fame was built on strategic self-exposure. Her gold sequin dress clung to her like liquid, designed to catch the light and every wandering eye. She stuck to Gregory's side as if anchored there, her laughter cutting through the air, louder than the polite, restrained chuckles of the older guests. Her presence was no secret. For nearly a year, society gossip columns had speculated about her relationship with Gregory. What was whispered in private had now stepped directly into Eleanor's line of sight. It was during one of the evening's mingling sessions, while Eleanor was speaking to the gala's chairwoman, that she caught April's voice, pitched just enough to carry. "Can you believe it? It's like she just stepped out of a 2010 catalogue." A few sycophantic giggles followed. Then came the follow-up. "I mean, this is the heart of the Metropolis Gala, not a suburban book club meeting. Gregory has an image to maintain." The words were chosen carefully, delivered like a poisoned dart. They weren't just about a dress. They were about relevance, about belonging, about whether Eleanor deserved a place in the very world she had helped Gregory conquer. The sting was immediate and physical. Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the pressure tighten in her chest. In that moment, a mental inventory flashed through her mind. The late nights spent hosting investor dinners, the personal details she'd memorized to make Gregory's clients feel valued, the years she had been the calm, steady counterpart to his ambition. All of it dismissed in a single public comment by the woman who now occupied his arm. Many women in her position might have reacted with an impulsive outburst, but Eleanor had never been impulsive. Her response was to steady her breathing, murmur an excuse to her conversation partner, and step out onto the terrace. Central Park spread out below, dark and endless, its edges lit by the city beyond. She gripped the cold stone balustrade, knuckles white, and in the quiet, she saw the truth laid bare. Her silence, her refusal to engage in petty confrontation, had been mistaken for weakness. Gregory found her there minutes later. His tone was light, almost performative. "There you are. Tanaka's about to leave. I want us to say goodbye together." He brushed off her reference to April's remarks with a vague, "She's young, she doesn't understand," before suggesting she should buy something new. The reduction of the insult to nothing more than a fashion faux pas confirmed what she feared. He didn't see her as a partner anymore, only as a prop. That was the moment the course shifted. Eleanor understood that whatever came next wouldn't be about salvaging the marriage. It would be about reclaiming her place, her identity, and her influence. She would not disappear quietly, nor would she resort to public screaming matches. She would move carefully, deliberately, because true power, as her father had once told her, rarely needs to raise its voice. In the weeks to come, this resolve would become something far more dangerous than Gregory could imagine. But that night, on the terrace above Central Park, it was still just a seed, planted deep in the cold soil of humiliation. Eleanor left the gala with the same composed posture she had arrived with, but inside, a quiet war had begun. Eleanor Whitmore's life had long been a carefully curated image, the devoted wife, the gracious hostess, the steady presence beside one of Manhattan's most ambitious real estate magnates. But in the weeks following the heart of the city gala, the threads holding that image together began to loosen, not in public, where appearances remained polished, but behind the heavy walnut doors of their Fifth Avenue apartment. To the outside world, Richard Whitmore was in his prime. His development company had just secured a major contract to redevelop a section of the Brooklyn waterfront, a project that promised to cement his status among New York's most influential business leaders. Society pages still photographed him at charity functions, golf tournaments, and ribbon cuttings. But inside the marriage, there was a shift, subtle at first, like hairline cracks in fine china. It started with silence. Richard had always been talkative, quick to fill the air with stories of deals and dinners. Now, conversations were clipped. He left earlier in the mornings, came home later at night. The excuse was always business, but Eleanor knew better. She didn't need private investigators or whispered tips from well-meaning friends to confirm what her instinct screamed. Zara the flame-haired socialite was no fleeting distraction. She was becoming a fixture. Eleanor's humiliation at the gala had been more than a personal insult. It was a signal. Richard wasn't hiding the affair anymore. In the closed ecosystem of New York high society, that kind of brazenness was almost more damaging than the betrayal itself. Affairs were not uncommon in their circle, but they were discreet, hidden behind charity trips, business travel, and the polite fiction of separate bedrooms. Richard's choice to flaunt Zara was a deliberate message to everyone, including Eleanor: I am untouchable. In the quiet of her dressing room, Eleanor began to replay the years of her marriage with new clarity. She thought of the early days, when Richard was a struggling broker and she, the daughter of a respected investment banker, had provided introductions, stability, and the kind of social credibility money alone couldn't buy. She remembered the dinner she hosted, the deals that had been sealed over her perfectly set table, the clients she had charmed. She had been a partner in every sense, but her contributions had become invisible in the glare of his growing success. The shift from reflection to action was almost imperceptible. One morning, over coffee, Eleanor asked Richard for a copy of their latest joint financial statements. He looked up from his phone, mildly puzzled. Why? You've never cared about that before. I care now, she replied simply. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration. Over the next few weeks, she began mapping the architecture of their financial world. Trusts, shell companies, joint investments, private holdings in Aspen, Palm Beach, and Napa, all the things she had once left entirely in his hands. With the precision of someone piecing together a puzzle, she identified what was hers, what was his, and what they had built together. She noticed patterns in transfers, loans disguised as project expenses, and the slow siphoning of assets toward ventures that bore Zara's name somewhere in the fine print. Her father's lessons came back to her with startling clarity. Money isn't just currency. It's leverage. And leverage, used wisely, is power. Still, Eleanor was patient. She didn't confront him. Instead, she began reaching out discreetly to allies from different corners of their shared world. Serena Vance, the formidable event strategist who had managed the gala circuit for half the city's elite, became an unexpected confidant. Over a lunch at the Carlyle, Eleanor outlined her desire to re-establish the Langley Foundation, the dormant arts charity founded by her grandfather. Serena listened, nodded, and smiled a slow, knowing smile. If you're going to do this, we'll do it properly. Quietly at first. Then all at once. Eleanor's next call was to Antoine Duval, a Paris-based couturier whose designs whispered sophistication rather than shouted for attention. Antoine had dressed queens, diplomats, and the occasional Hollywood actress willing to trade flash for gravitas. To him, Eleanor said only, I don't need a dress. I need armor. He understood. Even as she built her new network, Eleanor maintained the outward rhythms of her marriage. She attended board dinners, smiled for photographs, and accompanied Richard to charity events, all the while storing every careless remark, every subtle slight, in the vault of her memory. Zara's public commentary on Eleanor's dated style had been the kind of insult that travels fast in their circles. The younger woman was getting bolder, perhaps emboldened by Richard's unwavering public attention. What Zara failed to see was that the performance had an expiration date. By mid-February, Eleanor had quietly secured her position. The Langley Foundation's relaunch was planned for late spring, coinciding with one of New York's most photographed events, the Modern Masters Gala at the Met. The guest list was a who's who of art, finance, and media. With Serena's influence, Eleanor would not just attend, she would dominate the narrative. But dominance required preparation. In her private study, Eleanor began drafting the Foundation's mission statement, its funding priorities, and its initial slate of board members. She reached out to Beatrice Dubois, the grande dame of the New York art world, whose endorsement could turn a fledgling cultural initiative into an institution. She met discreetly with Michael Chen, one of Richard's fiercest business rivals, to discuss co-sponsorship of a major arts education program. Each meeting was held under the guise of personal interest, but every handshake, every agreement, was another brick in the fortress she was building. The most striking thing was how little Richard noticed. In his mind, Eleanor's activities were harmless, a charming project for his wife, akin to redecorating a penthouse or adopting a cause of the month. He didn't see the pattern forming, the quiet consolidation of influence, the alliances that extended beyond his reach. He was too busy managing Zara's social profile, ensuring she was photographed at the right parties and avoiding the wrong ones. For Eleanor, the months between the gala and spring were not a retreat. They were reconnaissance. Every move was deliberate, every step calculated. She was no longer reacting to humiliation. She was setting the stage for something far more profound, a reclamation of her identity, her dignity, and her power, all in full view of the very world that had once looked at her with polite pity. The moment would come. And when it did, it would not be a scene of tears or shouting matches. It would be a shift so complete, so undeniable, that even Richard would be forced to reckon with the woman he had underestimated. Eleanor didn't just want to survive this. She wanted to redefine the game entirely. Eleanor Whitmore didn't begin her counteroffensive with a public declaration. She began it quietly, in the privacy of her own home office, surrounded by stacks of bank statements, trust agreements, and investment portfolios that had once been little more than background noise in her life. For years, Richard had told her not to worry herself with the complexities of the family's finances. It was a world he controlled entirely by design. That arrangement had suited her, until now. Now, it was a liability she could no longer afford. The first thing she did was request complete copies of every account and holding connected to both her name and Richard's. The request was phrased politely but with a firmness her accountant, Mr. Gaines, had never heard from her before. He asked no questions, at least not out loud, but the raised eyebrow he gave her over the phone told her he understood this was not routine. Within 3 days, couriered envelopes began arriving, each one heavy with paper, each one a window into the empire she had helped sustain without truly seeing. Eleanor read late into the night, night after night. She discovered that while Richard's net worth was substantial, much of it was propped up by debt, fragile joint ventures, and partnerships that could sour with a single change in market sentiment. There were trusts, some of which included her as a beneficiary, others that did not. There were assets in her name she hadn't realized existed, a stake in a midtown office building, a sliver of a private equity fund. Slowly, a map of his holdings began to take shape in her mind, along with something else: opportunity. She began making calls to people Richard had long dismissed as irrelevant to her. A private banker at Langley & Company she had met years ago at a charity luncheon. The legal counsel for a philanthropic trust where she'd once served as an honorary board member. Even her late father's old investment advisor, a quiet, silver-haired man named Thomas Baird, who had always spoken to her as though she were an equal. These were not allies of Richard. They were, increasingly, hers. Baird in particular proved invaluable. He reminded her of lessons her father had once tried to instill: the importance of separating sentiment from numbers, the necessity of creating structures that could endure without the personality of one person holding them together. "Your husband's influence is vast," he told her over tea at the Union Club. "But it's brittle, Eleanor, built on perception and the momentum of his charm. If you take control of your own resources, you take away his leverage." It was during one of these meetings that the idea of reviving the Whitmore Foundation surfaced. The foundation had been dormant for over a decade, a victim of shifting family priorities after her father's death. Richard had never seen the point of keeping it alive. To him, Philanthropy was merely a tool for networking with the right people. To Eleanor, it was different. It was legacy. And now, it could be more than that. It could be a platform. A way to reclaim her identity in a language Richard would underestimate until it was too late. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed a strategist. That was where Serena Vance came in. Serena was a public relations powerhouse in the rarefied air of Manhattan's elite circles. She could take a client from invisible to indispensable in 6 weeks, provided they were willing to follow her playbook. Eleanor met her at an art opening in Soho, introduced by a mutual friend who knew exactly what kind of transformation Eleanor had in mind. Serena, impeccably dressed in an architectural white blazer, listened intently as Eleanor outlined her plan, not in terms of scandal or payback, but in terms of narrative control. "You're not trying to win a headline," Serena said finally. "You're trying to win the long game." "Exactly," Eleanor replied. Over the next few weeks, Serena and her small, razor-sharp team began crafting the image of Eleanor Whitmore 2.0. They didn't leak gossip about Richard or Zara too crude, too obvious. Instead, they seeded stories in society columns about the quiet resurgence of understated influence. A profile in a lifestyle magazine about women reclaiming family legacies included a photograph of Eleanor in her home library, surrounded by art books and sketches for an upcoming cultural initiative. Invitations began arriving in her name, not in Richard's. Meanwhile, Zara's social media, once a cascade of curated glamour shots, began to face subtle, almost invisible pushback. Anonymous comments pointing out the excess, the lack of substance. None of it could be traced back to Eleanor or Serena's team, but the shift was noticeable. The more Zara posted, the more she seemed out of sync with the emerging narrative of refined, purposeful womanhood. The cornerstone of Eleanor's plan was the relaunch of the Whitmore Foundation at a public event that would eclipse anything Richard could stage, a place where she would not be standing in his shadow but at the center of her own sphere. Serena suggested the Modern Masters Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an event that drew more cameras, more headlines, and more high-caliber guests than almost any other on the social calendar. "It's where perception becomes reality," Serena said. "And once people see you differently, they will never see you the old way again." Securing the right look for that night became an operation in itself. Eleanor wasn't interested in anything trendy. She needed something timeless yet unforgettable, armor disguised as elegance. Serena introduced her to Antoine Devereux, a Paris-based designer known for creating gowns that whispered power rather than shouted for attention. Over several private fittings, the concept took shape: midnight blue silk, cut in a column that elongated her frame, the surface alive with hand-sewn platinum beadwork in a constellation pattern that caught the light in unpredictable, mesmerizing ways. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also symbolic. Eleanor would walk into that room as the fixed star around which everything else revolved. Even as plans solidified, Eleanor maintained her outward composure in the life she still shared with Richard. They attended dinners, exchanged polite words, played their roles. He was busy finalizing a major real estate deal with Japanese investors and saw her recent activity as a charming diversion, perhaps even a harmless boost to his own image. It never occurred to him that she was building something entirely separate from him. His mistress, however, was not so blind. Zara began making small but telling adjustments, posting more serious content, speaking in interviews about causes she suddenly claimed to care about. It was too late. The social tide was shifting. People in their circle, especially the women, were aligning themselves with Eleanor, drawn not by pity but by respect. They saw in her a kind of strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. By the time the invitations for the Modern Masters Gala were sent out, Eleanor's name carried weight on its own. The press release announcing the Whitmore Foundation's new mission funding arts education for underserved communities landed in the inboxes of every major lifestyle editor in the city. The launch would be unveiled at the gala, in front of the city's most influential eyes. Richard, still preoccupied with closing his deal, barely registered the significance. To him, the gala was just another glittering obligation. To Eleanor, it was the battlefield where she would change the balance of power forever. And as the date drew closer, the city's attention began to shift. Not toward Richard. Not toward Zara. Toward Eleanor Whitmore. The first real crack in Richard Ashworth's carefully constructed facade appeared not in a front-page expose, but in the form of a phone call that Catherine received late on a Thursday afternoon. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, almost too polite. He introduced himself as a private investigator retained by an interested party, a vague phrase Catherine recognized instantly as deliberate. He said he had information about transactions connected to Ashworth Holdings that she might find relevant. Catherine, ever the strategist, didn't ask questions on the phone. She set a meeting for the following day in a quiet midtown law office she had used years ago during an unrelated legal matter. When she arrived, the man late 50s, neatly pressed grey suit, clear blue eyes slid a slim manila folder across the table. Inside was a series of financial statements, wire transfers, and property records. Most of it she didn't recognize, but the addresses caught her attention: a penthouse in Miami, a boutique property in Aspen, and a sprawling beachfront estate in the Hamptons. None of them were in her name. The paper trail suggested these purchases had been made through layered shell companies, with cash infusions from accounts tied indirectly but unmistakably to Richard's primary holding company. And in 2 cases, the listed consultant on the projects was Zara Flynn. Catherine didn't react visibly. She simply closed the folder, thanked the investigator, and promised to be in touch. But inside, a cold clarity settled over her. This wasn't about a mistress flaunting herself at social events. It was about assets being siphoned into a parallel life, one that Richard had no intention of disclosing. It was also the kind of detail that, if brought to the right light, could undermine his credibility with investors who valued discretion above all else. Over the following weeks, Catherine began building her own quiet case. She called in favors from friends in banking, discreetly asked questions about certain property deals, and reviewed years of trust documents she had previously ignored. She found patterns small at first, then impossible to overlook. Large transfers in the weeks before key acquisitions. Payments to obscure consulting firms with no public footprint. Always followed by Zara appearing in a new apartment, a new car, or on vacation in a location that matched the purchase records. But Catherine wasn't interested in using this information to blow up Richard's reputation in a tabloid scandal. That would be loud, messy, and in his world survivable. What she wanted was leverage. The kind that whispered instead of shouted. The kind that made board members nervous and bankers cautious without ever producing a single headline. Her first quiet move was to speak with Michael Chen. She chose her timing carefully, inviting him to lunch at a discreet private dining room in a financial district club where she knew Richard was not a member. She laid out a condensed, surgical version of what she had found. Chen listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing, but Catherine noticed how he leaned forward slightly when she mentioned the Miami property and its unexplained funding source. He knew the implications. In his world, even the rumor of impropriety could shift millions in market value. The second step was more personal. She arranged a meeting with Mrs. Tanaka, framing it as a conversation about the Langley Foundation's early grant-making priorities. Between discussions of arts education and preservation of traditional crafts, Catherine mentioned almost in passing that she had been reviewing some of her husband's recent ventures and was concerned about certain exposures. She didn't elaborate, but she didn't have to. Mrs. Tanaka, who had lived long enough in both corporate and diplomatic circles to understand the unspoken, simply nodded. What Catherine understood and what Richard never grasped was that in their world, perception was often more powerful than proof. By planting the idea that Richard's empire might not be as stable, as clean, or as well managed as it appeared, she was setting into motion a chain of quiet doubts. Doubts that would linger in boardrooms and private dinners long after the conversation had ended. Meanwhile, she gathered her own protective measures. With the help of a discreet attorney, she created a separate trust funded entirely from assets under her sole legal control, a blend of inherited funds and investments Richard had never bothered to monitor. This was her insurance policy, a foundation not just for her philanthropic ambitions, but for her independence should the marriage's public facade collapse. By the end of the month, Catherine had what she needed, not just evidence of questionable transactions, but a network of influential allies who now viewed her as an independent actor, competent, strategic, and worth supporting. The investigation had never involved subpoenas or court orders. There had been no dramatic confrontations or public accusations. But in her world, the silence was its own kind of verdict. And Richard. He was still smiling for the cameras, still shaking hands with investors, still convinced that the battle was about appearances at galas and the cut of a dress. He didn't see the quiet rebalancing of power that was already tipping the scales against him. Catherine knew it was only a matter of time before the evidence she had gathered and the perception she had shaped would force him into a corner from which even his considerable charm couldn't extract him. In the months to come, the whispers would grow. A missed bid here. A stalled loan there. A meeting cancelled at the last minute without explanation. None of it would be traced directly to her, but all of it would flow from the foundation she had laid in those weeks of quiet, methodical investigation. In her mind, this was no longer about a marriage. It was about territory, and she was reclaiming hers inch by inch. The Met Gala had always been a kind of secular coronation for New York's elite. Every May, its marble steps transformed into a runway where fortunes, reputations, and egos paraded under the scrutiny of the world's most unforgiving lenses. For years, Catherine Ashworth had stood in the background, a well-groomed shadow to her husband's ambitions. But on this night, she wasn't arriving to play the role of silent spouse. She was walking into a carefully laid ambush, one she had been building piece by piece for weeks. The streets outside the Metropolitan Museum were already sealed off, lined with barricades holding back clusters of spectators and photographers. The theme this year, Celestial Bodies, had inspired a parade of gold leaf headpieces, floor-sweeping trains, and jewel-encrusted fantasies. Inside the building, Richard Ashworth was already holding court, arriving ahead of his wife as he often did. He was dressed in a sharply tailored midnight tuxedo, the kind that made him look like the embodiment of control. To him, this was a celebration of victory. The Tanaka deal signed that morning, the investors satisfied, and his social position reaffirmed. He didn't notice how many of those investors were talking about a name other than his. From the moment Catherine's black Maybach pulled to the curb, the atmosphere shifted. She emerged slowly, stepping onto the carpet as though she had been doing it her entire life. The gown was everything she had envisioned, a column of midnight silk so deep it seemed to absorb light, with hand-sewn platinum beads forming a constellation that drew the eye upward. The craftsmanship was flawless, but it wasn't just the dress, it was the woman wearing it. The poise, the unhurried pace, the expression that balanced serenity with unmistakable authority. She looked like someone who belonged at the very center of this world. Camera flashes exploded in a staccato rhythm, each burst accompanied by the murmur of her name. Catherine Ashworth. Vogue wanted an interview. The New York Times sent a reporter sprinting from the press line. A correspondent from a Japanese fashion network whispered, "That's her," as though witnessing a rare celestial event. Richard noticed the commotion from inside the museum's glass entrance. At first, he assumed another celebrity had arrived. Then he saw her. For a split second, his expression was one of genuine surprise, perhaps even admiration. But the admiration faded quickly into calculation. Catherine had never sought this level of attention before. What was she doing? The answer arrived within minutes. Once she reached the top of the steps, she was met by Serena Vance, the strategist who had orchestrated the night with military precision. Serena guided her straight into a waiting circle of reporters. The questions came quickly. "Mrs. Ashworth, you look extraordinary tonight. Is there a special occasion?" Catherine smiled, a small, deliberate curve of the lips. "Thank you. Tonight, I'm proud to announce the relaunch of the Langley Foundation for the Arts. Our mission is to fund arts education in New York City's most underserved communities. It's something I've been quietly working on for months, and tonight felt like the right moment to share it." Her voice carried, calm and assured, over the low roar of the crowd. Serena had made certain that every major outlet had their microphones ready. There was no mention of Richard, no reference to their marriage, no hint of scandal. This was her initiative, her platform, her stage. Inside, Richard found himself suddenly invisible. The guests who had come to congratulate him on his latest deal were drifting toward the buzz outside. The photographers who had once followed his every move were locked on Catherine. He caught sight of Mr. Tanaka speaking with his wife, both of them nodding as a reporter relayed Catherine's announcement. This was not the casual charity project of a bored socialite. It was a full-scale operation, with influential names already attached and a clear plan for public impact. Zara Flynn, who had arrived in a gold-sequined gown designed for maximum attention, stood off to the side. Her practiced smile was slipping. The social media influencers clustered around her were distracted, their phones aimed at Catherine instead. Zara's feed would later tell the story. The number of likes on her posts halved within hours, comments shifting from admiration to comparison. "This is real class," one wrote beneath a photo of Catherine's interview. "Not the glitter for Instagram kind." While Catherine moved gracefully from one media engagement to the next, Richard tried to regain control. He approached her as she stepped away from the press line, forcing a smile for the benefit of nearby cameras. "You could have told me," he said under his breath. "You would have tried to stop me," she replied, her tone even. "And this isn't about you." It was the first time he'd heard her speak to him that way in public, not with hostility, but with the finality of someone who no longer required his approval. Before he could respond, Serena was at her side again, leading her toward a table where Mr. Tanaka and his wife were seated. Catherine greeted them with genuine warmth, discussing the Foundation's first major project, restoring a historic community art center in Queens. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it achieved what Catherine intended. The most influential guests in the room now saw her not as Richard's wife, but as a figure in her own right, a leader with vision, resources, and the connections to make things happen. By the end of the evening, the shift in social gravity was complete. The coverage the next morning proved it. Headlines in the Style and Society pages focused not on the Tanaka deal, but on Catherine Ashworth's dazzling debut as a philanthropic force. Editorials praised her elegance and strategic timing. Commentators speculated that the Langley Foundation could become one of the city's most significant arts benefactors. Richard's business success was reduced to a sidebar in the financial section. For Zara, the fallout was immediate and brutal. Invitations that once flowed freely slowed to a trickle. Influential women in their circle, women who had smiled politely at her before, now openly favored Catherine. Social media turned on her with ruthless speed. "While you're chasing likes, she's changing lives," one comment read. It was liked thousands of times. Richard understood, at least in part, what had happened. But he didn't grasp the full scope. Catherine hadn't just reclaimed her dignity. She had shifted the balance of power in their marriage and in the broader network of relationships that sustained his business. Every alliance she formed, every public appearance she made, was another thread pulled from the fabric of his control. And she had done it without a single public fight, without raising her voice, without resorting to scandal. She had played the long game and won. What remained was the conversation that would redefine their future. But Catherine wasn't in a hurry to have it. She knew that by the time they sat down in private, he would already understand one unshakable truth: the days of her standing quietly in his shadow were over. Richard Ashworth's downfall didn't erupt like an explosion. It seeped through the cracks of his empire like water in old stone, silent at first, then relentless. The morning after the Met Gala, he still clung to the belief that the new cycle would swing back in his favor. Deals were deals. Money was money. Surely the media frenzy over Catherine's little arts project would fade. But by midweek, he realized the narrative had changed, and this time, it wasn't in his control. He had underestimated the staying power of Catherine's reemergence. The photographs from the gala, her in that midnight blue gown, the constellation of beads shimmering under the flash of cameras, had been everywhere. Society pages, art blogs, even the business section. Every caption paired her image with phrases like quiet power, philanthropic vision, and the return of a true New York grande dame. The Foundation's mission, arts education for underserved communities, struck a chord with the press. It was dignified, tangible, and impossible to dismiss as vanity. Inside Ashworth Holdings, the mood shifted. Board members who once greeted Richard with eager smiles now met him with guarded expressions. Some stopped returning calls altogether. A senior partner, one of his oldest allies, sent a carefully worded email suggesting they explore more collaborative opportunities with the Langley Foundation, subtly aligning himself with Catherine's camp. The message was clear: she was the safer bet. Catherine hadn't reached this point by accident. Every meeting she'd arranged in the months prior, the lunches, the discreet conversations, the introductions Serena Vance orchestrated, had been pieces of a larger strategy. Now, they were paying off. Her foundation's board read like a who's who of Manhattan's power set: Michael Chen, Beatrice Dubois, Mrs. Tanaka. People who not only carried influence but who also had long memories and, in some cases, grudges against Richard. It wasn't lost on Richard that some of these alliances had been forged in spaces he dismissed as irrelevant: art galleries, charity luncheons, private salons. He had spent his career in boardrooms and construction sites, convinced that hard numbers and skyscrapers were the true measure of power. Catherine understood something he didn't. In New York, social capital could be just as lethal as financial capital, especially when wielded by someone with patience. The first tangible blow came from a bank he had relied on for decades. A routine line of credit renewal was temporarily postponed pending further review. The reason, couched in layers of corporate politeness, was a reassessment of leadership stability. In private, he knew what it meant. The bank had seen the coverage, read between the lines, and decided Catherine was the steady hand in the Ashworth equation. Without her visible support, he looked like a liability. Zara sensed the shift too, though she tried to mask it with defiance. She doubled down on social media, posting glamorous photos from her Monaco trip, peppered with captions like "unbothered" and "winning season." But the comments told a different story. Followers began questioning her, drawing unflattering comparisons to Catherine. "While you're sipping champagne, she's changing lives," one wrote. Another, "Class versus flash, and we all know who's winning." The tension between Zara and Richard grew sharper. She had enjoyed the sparkle of being on his arm when he was untouchable, but now the luster was dimming. Invitations to high-profile events dried up. Even friends who had once embraced her now kept their distance. One night, over a late dinner in his penthouse, she confronted him. "This isn't what I signed up for," she said, her voice tight. "People are looking at me like I'm cheap." Richard, exhausted and under siege, snapped. "Maybe stop giving them reasons to." The silence that followed was heavy, and though Zara stayed the night, they both knew something had fractured. Meanwhile, Catherine moved quietly but decisively. She expanded the Foundation's public profile, announcing a series of high-visibility projects, restoring a historic Harlem theater, funding art workshops in public schools, commissioning murals in underrepresented neighborhoods. The initiatives were covered not only in lifestyle magazines but also in mainstream news outlets. Her name was now synonymous with cultural preservation and community investment. At a dinner hosted by the Tanakas, Catherine sat between Mr. Tanaka and Michael Chen, effortlessly steering the conversation toward the intersection of art and economic revitalization. Richard, seated further down the table, watched as the two men who had once been his stanchest competitors leaned in to hear Catherine's thoughts. He wasn't in the conversation literally or figuratively. The most devastating moment came during a quarterly investor meeting. Richard began his presentation with the usual confidence, outlining new development projects and projected returns. But when the floor opened for questions, one investor asked about the Foundation's integration into our corporate social responsibility strategy. Another inquired whether Catherine's growing influence in the philanthropic sector could open new partnership opportunities. It was subtle but clear. They were looking past him, toward her. By summer's end, Richard's empire was still standing, but it felt hollow. Deals took longer to close. Lenders demanded more assurances. Partners hesitated before committing. His authority, once unquestioned, was now negotiated. Catherine hadn't attacked his business head-on, she'd simply made herself indispensable to the very network that sustained it. Without her, it all felt precarious. One late evening, he found himself in his study, staring at a framed photo from their early years, the two of them on the balcony of a Paris hotel, laughing over glasses of wine. Back then, he'd seen her as a partner. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped. He wondered now if she had felt the shift long before he realized it. Catherine entered quietly, a file in her hand. She placed it on the desk. "These are the final terms," she said. He glanced down, a formal separation of their personal and professional lives. The marriage, as she put it, in its traditional form, was over. Publicly, they would maintain civility. Privately, they would be independent entities. "You've won," he said finally, the words tasting bitter. "This was never about winning, Richard," she replied, her voice steady. "It was about respect, and I won't live without it." As she left the room, he realized the truth. She had built her new life not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. And in doing so, she had taken the one thing he thought was his alone control. Autumn settled over New York with a kind of brittle sharpness, the kind that made every shadow seem longer, every word carry a little more weight. By now, the balance of power between Richard and Catherine had shifted so decisively that even those who pretended neutrality had begun to choose sides. The air in their circles was full of polite whispers, the kind that never quite reached the press but traveled efficiently from one dinner party to another. Richard still had money. He still had properties, influence, and the lingering aura of a man who had once been untouchable. But he was learning, painfully, that influence was only as strong as the network that held it in place. And his network was thinning. The final turning point began not with a headline, but with a document, a 16-page financial disclosure Catherine received in a plain envelope, delivered by courier to her Foundation's office. She had requested it weeks earlier from a contact in a private banking firm, a man she'd known since her father's days in investment banking. It contained an audit of several offshore accounts tied to Ashworth Holdings. Catherine didn't need to be an accountant to see the pattern. Transfers routed through shell corporations, funds parked in obscure jurisdictions, and several withdrawals that didn't match any declared business expense. They weren't illegal on their face, but they raised questions. And questions, in the wrong hands, could destroy reputations faster than any scandal. She didn't move immediately. Catherine understood timing. It was the same patience she'd used to plan her return at the Met Gala. She kept the file locked in her office safe and continued her work as if nothing had changed. Publicly, she was still the serene philanthropist, announcing new art initiatives and expanding her foundation's partnerships. Privately, she began speaking to a small circle of trusted allies about contingency planning. One of those allies was Michael Chen. Over lunch in a quiet corner of the Lambs Club, she slid a single page of the audit across the table. Chen studied it without comment, then looked up. If this reached the wrong person, it would be inconvenient for him, he said slowly. Catherine didn't confirm or deny. She only replied, "Sometimes, Michael, the mere existence of something is enough to change the conversation." Meanwhile, Richard was feeling the pinch more acutely. The stalled credit line had become a real operational headache. 2 projects were on hold, contractors were restless, and a handful of investors were asking for early returns. His days were consumed with patching holes, and his nights with arguments with Zara, with lawyers, sometimes even with himself. Zara had become more openly resentful. She accused him of letting Catherine run the show, and of caring more about public perception than about them. The truth, which Richard didn't admit even to himself, was that he did care more about perception because perception was currency in his world. And right now, his currency was devaluing fast. The confrontation came one evening at the Fifth Avenue apartment. Catherine had agreed to meet in the study, the one room they still shared in a purely functional sense. Richard started with small talk, as if they could somehow slide back into civility. She cut him off. "I know about the accounts, Richard." For a long moment, he didn't react. Then, a slow exhale. "So," he said finally, his tone flat. "So," she replied evenly. "You understand what that means. For the board. For your lenders. For your precious image." She let the words hang between them. "I have no interest in destroying you. But I won't let you undermine me. The terms we discussed stand. You run your company. I run my foundation. Publicly, we are aligned. Privately, we are independent. And you will not interfere with me in any capacity." Richard's jaw tightened. "And if I don't agree?" Catherine met his gaze, her expression as calm as if she were discussing menu options. "Then this file leaves my safe." It wasn't a threat in the shouted, theatrical sense. It was a statement of fact. And in that moment, Richard saw clearly what he had been denying for months. Catherine was no longer someone he could maneuver or placate. She was operating on an entirely different plane, one where she held the last piece of leverage he couldn't afford to lose. He agreed, of course. There was no other choice. The agreement was formalized in writing a week later, signed in the presence of lawyers who pretended not to sense the tension in the room. Richard got to keep his company, but at the cost of acknowledging Catherine's autonomy. She, in turn, promised to keep certain matters confidential. What he didn't realize, or perhaps refused to, was that Catherine's leverage was more than financial. Her public image now outshone his in every meaningful way. She was invited to speak at universities, to sit on panels about cultural preservation, to advise on arts policy at the city level. Every time her name appeared in print, it carried words like visionary and leader. Every time his did, it was attached to market speculation or lukewarm press releases. By winter, the shift was complete. Catherine had moved into her own townhouse on the Upper East Side, its walls already lined with contemporary art from the Foundation's network. Richard remained in the Fifth Avenue apartment, now quieter, emptier, the silence occasionally broken by the sound of Zara packing her things for good. The last time they were seen together in public was at a charity auction. They stood side by side for the cameras, smiling in the polished, careful way of people who have agreed to a truce. The flashbulbs caught the subtle details: her posture straight, his slightly bowed, her hand loosely at her side, his in his pocket. Those who knew how to read such things understood. The real story was not in the photographs, but in the space between them. Catherine left the event early, slipping into the back of a black car that took her to a late meeting with the Foundation's advisory board. Richard stayed behind, fielding questions about a new development deal that even he knew might not materialize. The whispers in the room were no longer about Catherine's dress or Richard's mistress. They were about influence, legacy, and the quiet, decisive way Catherine Ashworth had rewritten the rules. And though Richard would never admit it aloud, he understood something he had spent years ignoring. Sometimes, the most dangerous adversary is the one who doesn't need to raise her voice.